The negotiations began the following morning, and within the first hour of the first session, Voss understood with perfect clarity exactly what was happening. The Council called it an integration framework, a formal package of agreements that would, in theory, grant humanity a provisional seat at the galactic table in exchange for certain mutually beneficial concessions. The word mutually was doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and the more Voss read, the more clearly she could see the scene where the language strained under the weight of what it was actually describing. The concessions were these. Humanity would share its adaptive FTL drive technology, the single most significant navigational innovation produced in the last 2 centuries, with the Council in full. Humanity would submit its self-evolving artificial intelligence networks, including Oracle, the most sophisticated AI architecture ever built, to GRC regulatory oversight with full access provisions. Humanity would cap its territorial expansion at 12 approved systems and surrender the remaining 26 active colonies to Council protectorate governance, administered by GRC-appointed officials who would answer exclusively to Axis Eternum. And humanity would reduce its combined military fleet by 60% within 2 galactic standard years. In exchange, humanity would receive trade access to Council markets, protection under the GRC Mutual Defense Pact, which had never once been invoked to defend a species that did not already have the power to defend itself, and the right to send a non-voting observer to Council sessions. An observer. The word sat in Voss's mind with the particular weight of a precisely chosen insult. It was not a negotiation. It was a leash wrapped in silk, presented as a gift. Voss read every line of the framework twice, moving through the dense diplomatic language with the methodical patience of someone who had drafted similar documents herself and therefore understood every technique being used. She asked 17 clarifying questions, calm, specific, technical questions that the Council's representatives clearly had not expected, because species arriving at this table for the first time were generally not in a state of mind that allowed for technical precision. They agreed to a recess so she could consult with Earth. KHO granted it with a wave of his hand. The gesture was deliberately reminiscent of the way someone might give a child permission to step away from the table. During the recess, Voss gathered her team in their assigned quarters, comfortable rooms that were almost certainly monitored by 6 different sensor arrays, a fact she had accounted for, and laid everything out in plain language. "They want our technology, our territory, and our teeth," she said quietly, standing at the center of the room where the sensor angles were worst. "In exchange, they are offering us the privilege of watching them make decisions about our future from a chair that is deliberately 3 centimeters shorter than everyone else's." Captain Wren stood against the wall with her arms crossed and her jaw set in a line that communicated, very efficiently, everything she was not saying out loud. "We expected this," said Voss. "This is what they do. This is what they have always done." The Velisi signed under economic pressure. The Neth signed after a blockade that lasted 6 years. The Omare signed when their home world's biosphere was directly threatened. 100 others signed because they were made to believe they had no choice. She paused. "The only difference between all of them and us is that we recognize the pattern before we walk through that door." "We do," said one of the diplomats, quietly. "We do," said Voss. She returned to the negotiation table the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. 3 full diplomatic cycles, 26 standard days. Voss played the game with a kind of surgical precision that requires total control not just of what you say, but of what your face says when you are not speaking. She asked for amendments. She proposed counterterms. She requested additional data, supporting documentation, historical precedents. She complimented the Council on the thoroughness of their preparation. She asked follow-up questions to her own follow-up questions. She was unfailingly polite, consistently engaged, and absolutely, immovably patient. The Council mistook her patience for weakness. They mistook her politeness for submission. They mistook her question for confusion. Behind closed doors, Overlord KHL told his advisors that the humans were performing exactly as predicted. "Clever enough to ask questions," he said, settling back in his chair with the ease of someone who has done this 11 times before and found it increasingly routine. "But too young and too afraid to push back. They always sign. Every single one of them always signs." His chief general, the Skard Vorith, a veteran of 30 years of military campaigns who had once fought human soldiers in a brief border engagement 6 years earlier and had never entirely recovered from the experience, said nothing. He had watched a human frigate crew repair their own ship in the middle of active combat. Hull breached, oxygen venting. 3 crew members dead, using nothing but emergency welding kits and a stubbornness that did not seem to recognize surrender as an available option. He did not think the humans were bending. He thought they were coiling. But Overlord KHL did not appreciate disagreement, and Vorath had long since learned the difference between the truths that mattered and the truths that were survivable. On the 19th day of negotiations, a quiet figure requested a private meeting with Ambassador Voss. Counselor Ara's son was a representative of the Velisi communion, a species of natural empaths whose sensitivity to emotional frequencies was so refined that they experienced the feelings of other beings a way most creatures experience temperature, as a constant, ambient, unavoidable reality of the world they moved through. She was old even by Velisi standards, and she carried that age in a particular way of those who have witnessed too many things they cannot undo. She had been the only member of the council to vote against the integration framework in the closed session, and that vote had been ignored with the same efficiency as every other dissent she had registered in the last 4 centuries. She met Voss in a quiet observation lounge overlooking the stars, a room chosen, Voss suspected, because Sun understood instinctively that the vastness beyond the glass had a particular effect on conversations about large things. Sun studied the human ambassador with those large silver eyes that caught light in ways human eyes did not, and was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. "You are not what you are pretending to be," Sun said softly. Voss tilted her head and offered the measured smile of someone who has decided how to respond to this sentence before it was finished. "I am exactly what I need to be, counselor." "They do not negotiate with younger species," Sun said, and there was something in her voice that Voss recognized, after a moment, as grief, the grief of someone who has watched the same thing happen many times and has never found a way to stop it. "They absorb them. They take what is useful and discard the rest, and they dress the process in language that makes it sound like generosity. I have watched it happen 9 times. It does not change." Voss was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars with the expression of someone who has made a decision they do not intend to revisit. "We know," she said. 2 words, spoken without fear, without anger, without a single note of hesitation. Just 2 words, dropped into the silence between them like stones into still water. Sun felt the emotional substance beneath those words, and it made the small scales along the back of her neck rise involuntarily, not because of anything hostile in what she sensed, but because of what was absent. There was no fear. There was no desperation, no performance of confidence masking some deeper anxiety. What she felt from this human woman was something she had spent 400 years learning to identify in its many forms, and she had never felt it in quite this configuration before. It was resolve, not the fragile, performative resolve of a species trying to appear braver than it was, but the deep, structural resolve of something that had been tested so many times that it had stopped being a conscious choice and become simply a quality of the material. "Ambassador," Sun said, and she could not entirely keep the urgency from her voice. "If you leave this table without signing, there will be consequences. The council will not." "Counselor." Voss's voice was gentle, the way the deepest water is still. "I appreciate your concern. I genuinely do." She paused. "But fear is what you feel when you do not have a plan. And we have had a plan since before we walked through that door." She removed Sun's hand from her arm with care, turned, and walked back toward her quarters. Sun stood alone in the observation lounge for a long time afterward, looking at the stars, trying to understand what she had just felt and failing entirely to find a category for it. That night, Ambassador Voss returned to her quarters, dismissed her team with a quiet word, and sat alone in front of a secure communications terminal whose encryption architecture had been designed by Oracle specifically for this moment. She thought for a while about the word she was about to transmit, considered its weight, its implications, the chain of events it would set in motion across 38 star systems, and then she typed it into the interface with steady hands. Chrysalis. The word bounced through 14 relay stations before it reached Earth, traveling paths that no GRC sensor array had ever mapped because they had been built for exactly this purpose. Somewhere in the Sol system, in a room that had been kept dark for 7 years while the people inside it waited for this exact moment, a light came on, and the people in that room began to move. Operation Chrysalis had been conceived 7 years before the Council's invitation ever arrived, assembled in secret by a team of military strategists, behavioral economists, AI specialists, and game theorists who had done something no previous civilization had ever thought to do when facing the GRC. They had studied it. They had obtained records of every single integration the Council had ever conducted through the breakaway species, through intelligence channels, through patient archaeological reconstruction of documented history, and they had mapped every pattern, every pressure point, every moment where the Council's arrogance had created a structural vulnerability. They had built their plan around those vulnerabilities with the methodical thoroughness of engineers who understand that a structure is only as strong as its least examined assumption. Admiral Raj Morin received the Chrysalis activation code aboard his flagship, the UES Prometheus, which sat in deep orbit 3 light-years from Axis Eternum, surrounded by 200 warships running silent, their drives cold, their sensors passive, their crews moving through the darkness of deep space with the quiet discipline of professionals who had been waiting long enough that the waiting itself had become a kind of readiness. He read the code and felt not excitement, not relief, but simply the particular calm of someone for whom a long-anticipated moment has finally arrived exactly on schedule. Begin fleet repositioning, he told his operations officer. Phase 2. All carriers to dispersal coordinates. All supply ships to deep cache stations. All sensor platforms to blackout-ready status. Timeline, Admiral. We move when the Ambassador walks, Morin said. Not 1 second before. Across 38 star systems, the machinery of a civilization quietly shifted into a different gear, one that had existed all along but had never been engaged, waiting behind the ordinary rhythms of commerce and diplomacy for exactly this signal. Trade convoys that had operated on GRC-adjacent shipping lanes for decades rerouted onto hidden pathways that human explorers had mapped a generation ago and deliberately never shared with the Council. Deep space manufacturing stations, facilities built inside hollowed asteroids and systems that appeared dead on every galactic chart because they had been selected for their apparent uselessness, went dark to external sensors and began producing at wartime capacity. Diplomatic backchannels, developed patiently over years of quiet relationship building with species who resented the GRC's authority, opened with 3 non-council civilizations, the Draathi Pact, the Omare Collective, and the Neth Sovereignty. Agreements were reached in conversations that left no recoverable records. And Oracle, the self-evolving AI network that the Council had so desperately wanted to control, whose capabilities they had understood only enough to want to regulate, began running 14 million strategic simulations simultaneously, modeling every possible response the GRC might have to what was coming, and preparing countermeasures for each one, working with the perfect patience of mind that did not sleep, did not tire, and had been given a problem it found genuinely interesting. The final night before the concluding session, Voss stood alone at the viewport in her quarters and watched the stars, the same stars her ancestors had watched from caves, from fields, from rooftops, from the decks of seafaring vessels, from the surface of the moon, always asking the same fundamental question about what was out there and whether it was listening. Someone was out there, and they wanted to put her species in a box. She thought about all the times in human history someone had tried to put her species in a box. She thought about how every single one of those boxes had eventually been broken open from the inside, and how the people who built them had always been surprised, and how the surprise itself was, perhaps, the most human thing about the whole recurring story. Her aide knocked softly and handed her a datapad. She read the words on the screen, the final confirmation, the last piece sliding into place, and closed her eyes for a long moment. Then she put the datapad down, looked back at the stars, and whispered 2 words into the quiet of her room. We're ready. The Grand Conclave chamber on the morning of the final session was full in a way it had not been for decades. Every ruling species had sent not merely their council representative, but their complete senior delegations, advisors, military attachés, economic ministers, intelligence chiefs, because word had traveled through Axis Eternum's corridors like a current through water. Today was the day the humans would sign. It was supposed to be a formality. It was supposed to be a ceremony. The great circular table gleamed under the light of the galaxy map overhead, and the banners of the 12 ruling species hung like the flags of gods who had not yet learned the word humility. Overlord Tyvan Kechol arrived last, as he always did, because power, real power, the kind that has never been seriously tested, expresses itself in the luxury of making others wait. He settled into his chair at the head of the table and surveyed the assembled room with the satisfied expression of a predator who can already taste a conclusion. The human delegation entered quietly. Ambassador Ara Voss walked at the front in the same simple dark suit she had worn every day of the negotiations. Her hands were empty. Her expression was composed. Behind her came her 6 team members, moving with a synchronization that might have seemed rehearsed to anyone who was paying close enough attention. In that room, no one was paying close enough attention. Counselor Ara's son watched Voss take his seat, that deliberately smaller, deliberately lower chair, and felt, with the precision of someone whose sensitivity to emotional weather had never failed her in 400 years, a change in the chamber's atmosphere. It was subtle, like the pressure shift that precedes a storm. The emotions coming from the human delegation today were different. For 26 days, she had felt their controlled calm, their careful discipline, the steady hum of people maintaining composure through professional habit. Today, beneath all of that, she felt something new. It was quiet and vast and shaped like an exhale that has been held for a very long time. It was the emotional equivalent of a drawn sword held perfectly still. KHL opened the session with a speech about the historic nature of the occasion, how humanity was joining a tradition stretching back 14 millennia, how the galaxy was stronger when its species worked together under wise guidance, how Earth's children would find safety and prosperity within the Council's embrace. He spoke for 12 minutes, and every sentence was precision-engineered to make submission sound like wisdom, to make surrender sound like arrival, to make the act of signing a document that gave away everything you had built sound like the most sensible thing in the world. When he finished, he slid the final draft of the integration framework across the table toward Voss. 300 pages of dense legal language that translated, in plain terms, to the complete dismantling of human sovereignty, dressed in diplomatic phrasing so elaborate that several species had signed documents like it before fully understanding what they had agreed to. "We trust," KHO said, with the ancient smile of a man who has never once not gotten what he wanted, "that humanity sees a wisdom in cooperation." Voss looked at the treaty for a long moment. She did not pick it up. She did not open it. She stood. The motion was so simple and so entirely unexpected that it took the room 3 full seconds to process it. 3 seconds of complete silence in which every pair of alien eyes in that chamber turned to the small human woman who was now the only person standing in a room full of seated rulers of a known galaxy. KHO's smile did not disappear. It froze, becoming something harder, something with fractures running through it that had not been there before. "Ambassador," he said, and there was a finest edge of something in his voice that Sun recognized immediately as a thing that lives underneath certainty when certainty begins to suspect it might have been wrong. "The treaty requires your signature." Voss looked at him steadily. Her eyes were clear and dark and held the depth of someone who has already completed every calculation and arrived at the only answer that matters. "Earth declines," she said. The words hit the chamber with the impact of something physical. Somewhere behind KHO, an advisor dropped a datapad. The sound of it striking the polished floor was the loudest thing in the universe for one long, crystalline moment. No species had ever refused a GRC integration treaty. Not once, in 14,000 years of galactic civilization. The Velisi had signed under economic strangulation. The Neph had signed after 6 years of blockade. The Omare had signed when their home world's atmosphere was directly threatened. 100 others had signed because they were made to believe, correctly, in most cases, that they had no other choice. Every single one of them had signed, and the Council had stopped even considering the alternative so long ago that the question itself had become abstract. And now a civilization that had been traveling among the stars for barely 2 centuries was standing in the most consequential room in the galaxy and saying no. KHR leaned forward. His amber eyes narrowed to something cold and focused. "Repeat that," he said, and it was not a request. It was the sound of a system encountering an input it had no protocol for. Voss did not blink. She held his gaze with a particular steadiness of someone who has looked at harder things than this. "We have listened to your terms for 26 days, she said, and her voice carried every corner of the chamber with absolute clarity. "We gave you every opportunity to negotiate in good faith. You did not. You offered us subjugation dressed in diplomatic language. You demanded our technology, our territory, our military capacity, our genetic information, and our future. And in exchange, you offered us the privilege of silence." She paused, and the pause itself was a kind of argument. "So we decline. All of it." She reached into her jacket and removed her diplomatic credentials, the formal documentation that identified her as Earth's authorized representative to the Galactic Ruling Council, and placed them gently on the table beside the unsigned treaty. Then she turned and walked toward the chamber doors. Behind her, her entire delegation rose as one, a single, coordinated motion, timed to the second, planned months in advance. Their footsteps crossed the floor in unison and echoed in the stunned silence like a heartbeat that the room had not previously known was missing. KHO shot to his feet with a speed that was startling in someone of his composure. His chair scraped the floor with a sound like tearing metal. "You cannot leave." His voice had changed entirely. The resonant diplomatic instrument was gone, replaced by something raw and much older. "No species leaves this table. You will sit down and you will sign, or there will be consequences that your civilization cannot begin to imagine." Voss did not stop walking. "Ambassador!" Sun's voice was in the room now, sharp with alarm, not flooding from the humans, never from the humans, but pouring in waves from every other species in the chamber whose collective emotional state had shifted from smug confidence to something very close to panic in the space of a single breath. "If you leave, the Council will view this as an act of hostility." Voss stopped at the threshold. She turned. She looked not at Sun, but directly at KHO, meeting those amber predator eyes with her own dark, steady ones across the full length of the chamber. "No," she said, and her voice was quiet now, almost gentle, in a way that was somehow more affecting than any volume could have been. "An act of hostility is what comes next, if you follow us." She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she was not bluffing. Long enough for him to understand that she was not afraid. Long enough for him to understand, for perhaps the first time in his long and undefeated reign, that he was not the most dangerous intelligence in this room. Then she turned and walked through the doors, and they sealed behind her with finality that seemed disproportionate to simple metal meeting metal. The chamber erupted. 12 species began shouting simultaneously in a dozen different languages, the translators straining to keep pace as rulers who had not raised their voices in centuries found them again all at once. KHO roared for order, demanded the human delegation be detained, ordered his ZHO guard to intercept their shuttle, but the guard reported back within minutes that the humans were already aboard and burning hard for their fleet at maximum thrust. The shuttle had been prepped for emergency departure before the final session even began. They had known exactly how this would end because they had written the ending themselves. Sun sank back into her chair while the chaos churned around her and reached outward with her empathic senses, past the walls, past the hull, past the station's massive superstructure, toward the human ships that held position in the darkness beyond. What she found there turned the warmth in her blood to something colder. It was not panic. It was not confusion. It was not the desperate energy of a species that had just made a catastrophic mistake and was only now beginning to understand the consequences. What she felt from out there, from the crews of those human ships, was anticipation. Deep, fierce, unified, and ancient as bedrock. Soldiers and engineers, farmers and teachers, doctors and children, all connected across the vast architecture of their civilization by a single shared understanding. Their ambassador had just done what humanity had always done when someone tried to put a chain around its throat. She had said no. She had walked out, and every human alive knew exactly what came next, because it was not a plan, it was an instinct, written into the fiber of what they were by 10,000 years of surviving things that should have broken them. Sun closed her eyes and felt the full weight of what she had not understood until this moment. "What have we done?" she whispered, to no one, in the wrecked silence of her own mind. The Council expected war. Every strategic model they ran, every historical precedent their analysts consulted, every military simulation that combined computational resources could produce pointed toward the same conclusion. A species that rejected integration would strike first and strike hard, because that was what every cornered species did. The Council mobilized accordingly, the largest combined fleet in galactic history, over 12,000 warships drawn from all 12 ruling species, weapon systems capable of shattering moons and boiling oceans. KHO placed himself at the head of the armada aboard his flagship, the ZHL Dreadnought Eternal Wrath, and waited for the attack that all his models told him was coming. It did not come. In the first 48 hours, nothing. In the first week, human trade ships vanished from every galactic shipping lane, as if they had never existed. Tankers, couriers, passenger liners, all recalled into human space through routes that did not appear on any GRC navigation chart and could not be reconstructed from any available data. In the second week, every human embassy across the galaxy went dark simultaneously. Doors sealed, systems powered down. Staff departed through exit plans that had clearly been in preparation for months. The departures were calm and orderly. No one was left behind. Not a single document was left unsecured. In the third week, human communication relays went offline one by one in a cascade that spread across the Orion Arm like a wave moving through deep water, steady, inevitable, unstoppable. When GRC intelligence directed their long-range sensors toward human space, they encountered nothing but static. A network of sensor-blocking satellites had been deployed along the entire border of human territory, constructed to resemble debris, to look like dead rocks, to appear on every galactic chart as nothing at all. Behind that curtain of electronic silence, 38 star systems vanished from the observable galaxy as completely as if they had been erased from existence. Human space became a black box. And then the real consequences began to arrive. It started with the shipping lanes. Over 2 centuries of quiet, methodical spacefaring, human navigators had developed the most efficient FTL routing algorithms in the known galaxy, software that calculated optimal jump paths through the complex gravitational landscape of the Milky Way with a precision no other species had matched or, more critically, had needed to match, because the humans had always been there to provide it. 60% of all galactic trade routes had been running on those algorithms, a dependency so normalized that most shipping companies had long since stopped maintaining expertise in the older systems they had replaced. When the humans took their software with them, the lanes that had run like clockwork for decades became inefficient, unpredictable, and in some cases actively dangerous as pilots were forced back onto navigation tools that added weeks to journeys once measured in days. Trade slowed. Costs rose. Supply chains stretched thin across hundreds of light-years began to fray. Then the medical systems failed. Human biomedical technology, specifically the biosynthetic platforms that human engineers had developed and quietly made standard equipment across the galaxy, ran on proprietary software maintained by Earth's medical networks. Human-designed organ printers, human-engineered surgical nanobots, human-built pharmaceutical synthesis platforms, standard equipment in hospitals on over 200 worlds, maintained through periodic software updates that had been arriving automatically for so long that most facilities had stopped questioning where they came from. The update stopped. Within weeks, hospitals across dozens of worlds began reporting equipment degradation, drug synthesis failures, and a progressive breakdown of systems that no one else knew how to maintain because the humans had always been there when something needed fixing. On the agricultural front, the damage was slower in arriving and worse when it came. 3 council homeworlds, including the Koathi Union's primary food-producing planet, had been pulled back from the edge of civilizational famine in the previous century by human agricultural scientists who introduced crop engineering techniques that tripled yields and stabilized ecosystems that had been on the verge of irreversible collapse. Those techniques required ongoing maintenance, seasonal recalibration, and access to genetic databases that existed only on human servers. The servers were dark. The crops began failing in the 6th week. Rationing followed in the 8th. And through all of it, through every cascading failure, every emergency council session, every desperate search for replacements that didn't exist, the humans remained completely, entirely, impossibly silent. They did not threaten. They did not issue ultimatums. They did not negotiate or demand or gloat. They were simply absent. In the way that oxygen is absent when it's gone, you only understand how completely you have been breathing it when you can no longer find it anywhere. GRC economists projected a 12% contraction in galactic GDP within 3 months, rising to 25% within a year. Numbers that would have been considered catastrophic under any previous circumstances, but that had a particular quality of shock in a civilization that had genuinely not understood, until this moment, how much of its infrastructure had been built on a foundation that was not its own. No one had noticed because the humans had never made it obvious. They had not leveraged their position. They had not built dependencies and then held them over anyone's head. They had simply arrived, done exceptional work, solved problems that needed solving, and made themselves so integral to the functioning of galactic civilization that removing them was like discovering that the load-bearing wall you had been using as a backdrop was the only thing keeping the building standing. The building was still standing, But the cracks were spreading in every direction, and everyone could hear the sounds that buildings make before they stopped standing. Then the defections began. The Dryathi Pact, a coalition of 3 reptilian species who had chafed under GRC economic policy for generations and had been waiting, without quite admitting it to themselves, for exactly this kind of opening, formally announced their withdrawal from the Council and declared themselves neutral. The Omare Collective, a scholarly species whose own forced integration 4,000 years ago had left a wound that had never entirely healed, followed within a week, releasing a statement so restrained in its language and so devastating in its implications that it was reprinted on every news channel in the galaxy. We no longer have confidence in the Council's leadership or its vision for the galaxy. The Neth sovereignty, whose submission had been achieved through a blockade that the Council still described in its official histories as regulatory enforcement, broke away 3 days after the Omare and went further, establishing open trade relations with the periphery of human space through intermediaries that the GRC could not track. The Council was fracturing, and KHL could not stop it, because the things holding it together, the assumption of omnipotence, the certainty of consequence, the unquestioned belief that no species could afford to leave, had all been demonstrated, simultaneously and publicly, to be assumptions rather than facts. He raged in the war room of his flagship, surrounded by admirals who had no enemy to fight, and demanded a military answer. Send the fleet into human space. Breach the censor curtain. Force the humans back to the table at gunpoint. The words were the words of someone who had forgotten, temporarily, that force requires intelligence, and intelligence requires knowing where to point. Voss laid out the strategic reality in terms that could not be argued with, even if KHL had wanted to argue. They had no intelligence on what lay behind the censor curtain, no fleet positions, no defensive layouts, no knowledge of what the human manufacturing stations had been producing in 7 years of quiet preparation. Their navigation systems were degrading without human algorithms, which meant a coordinated fleet action across multiple star systems would be a logistical catastrophe even before the first shot was fired. And Oracle was already conducting electronic warfare across GRC space, feeding false data into sensor networks, generating phantom fleet signatures that force the Council to spread its forces thin across the galaxy, chasing apparitions that vanish when you arrive to investigate them. "If we go in blind," Voss said, and his voice carried the weight of a soldier who has learned to recognize a mistake before it finishes being made, "we will lose ships, many ships, and we will not know where the actual enemy is until they are already behind us." KHL demanded alternatives. There were none. Not because his advisors were incompetent, but because the humans had not done anything that could be answered with force. They had left. They had taken their things and gone home. Declaring war on a civilization for the act of declining a contract and walking out of a meeting would not merely break whatever remained of the Council's legitimacy. It would confirm, for every species in the galaxy, every suspicion anyone had ever had about what the Council actually was. Councilor Sun addressed the Council in a rare public session, standing before the same table where Voss had laid down her credentials, and her voice carried the tremor of someone choosing, at considerable personal cost, to say the true thing rather than the comfortable one. "We tried to cage a species that spent its entire history escaping cages," she said. "We did not offer them partnership. We offered them surrender wrapped in ceremony, and we were surprised, we are still surprised, that they refused it. We are not losing this conflict through any act of human cruelty or aggression. We are losing it through the weight of our own arrogance. The humans have not fired a single weapon, and yet the galaxy is rearranging itself around the fact of them because they did something we did not believe any species would do." She paused. They said no, and then they were patient enough to let us understand what that meant. KHL dismissed her words as sentiment. The solutions did not come, because there were no solutions that did not begin with the same truth that no one in that chamber was yet prepared to say out loud. They needed the humans far more than the humans needed them. Inside the silent black box of human space, life continued. The colonies were self-sufficient in ways that had been quietly, carefully built over years by planners who had always known that this day might come, who had built toward it not with bitterness or aggression, but with the patient pragmatism of people who understood that preparation was the only honest response to a universe that did not owe them anything. Admiral Morin's fleet stood ready, its discipline immaculate, its captains waiting with the professionalism of people who have been trusted with enormous power and have chosen, as an expression of that trust, to use none of it until the moment it was actually needed. Ambassador Voss worked from a quiet office on the colony world of New Geneva, coordinating the framework of what was beginning to be called the Open Accord, a network of trade, mutual defense, and cultural exchange between human space and the species that had chosen to leave the Council. It was not an empire and did not want to be. It was a demonstration, conducted patiently and without fanfare, of what the galaxy could look like if it was organized around cooperation rather than compliance. 4 months into the silence, Overlord Tyvan Kachal sat alone in his chambers aboard the Eternal Wrath and looked at a galaxy map that no longer looked like anything he recognized. His comm system chimed with an incoming message, unencrypted, transmitted openly, the origin point as clear and unhidden as a lighthouse. It was from Ambassador Voss. The message contained one line: "When you are ready to speak as equals, you know where to find us." KHO read it 7 times. He was the oldest ruler in the known galaxy, and in the whole of his very long life, he had not known what to do exactly twice. This was the 2nd time. 6 months after the Warcade, the Galactic Ruling Council still existed. But it existed the way a coat of paint exists on a wall whose foundation has begun to shift, present on the surface, increasingly disconnected from the structure beneath. 2 more species had defected since the initial wave, the Tesseri combined, a trading civilization whose entire economic model depended on functioning shipping algorithms that had never been repaired, and the Fail Ascendancy, a proud civilization that had watched its hospital systems fail and its citizens suffer and decided, finally, that loyalty to a collapsing order was not a virtue that justified the cost. The Open Accord now represented nearly a third of galactic civilization by population and almost half by economic output. The GRC's economy had contracted by 18% and was still falling. Worlds that had depended on human agricultural technology were rationing food. Worlds that had depended on human medical infrastructure were recording declining life expectancy for the first time in centuries. The shipping lanes remained degraded. Goods that once arrived in days now took weeks, when they arrived at all. And KHO ZHL Dominion, the 9,000-year-old empire that had never in its history faced a serious internal challenge, was watching 3 of its own colony worlds formally petition for negotiations with the humans, and when those petitions were ignored, begin refusing to remit their imperial taxes. He was not just losing the galaxy. He was losing his own people. So on a cold morning in the 6th month, Overlord Tyvan KHL did something that no ZHL ruler had done in living memory. He asked for help. The formal request for renewed negotiations traveled through a chain of intermediaries, the Net Sovereignty, who passed it to the Omere Collective, who passed it to the Drathi Pact, who delivered it to the Human Diplomatic Office on New Geneva. It was phrased with all the dignity that KHO could marshal, which was still considerable. But the message beneath the language was as clear and as plain as anything Voss had ever said across a negotiating table. "Please come back. We cannot do this without you." Voss read the request. Set it down. Thought for a long time, not about whether to respond, which had never been in question, but about how. Then she did something that every political strategist in human space called either the most brilliant or the most audacious decision of the entire operation, depending on whether they understood the difference. She made it public. Her acceptance was broadcast simultaneously on every galactic communication channel, open, unencrypted, available to every receiver in the Milky Way. And it included a full, unedited transcript of KHO's request, so that every civilization in the galaxy could see that the most powerful ruler in galactic history had asked humanity to come back to the table. It was not cruelty. It was transparency, the radical, irreversible kind that eliminates any future claim that the terms were imposed, that the process was coerced, that the outcome was anything other than freely chosen. Every species watching understood immediately. What was about to be negotiated was not just for humans. It was for everyone who had ever been told they had no other option. Voss was broadcasting an invitation. The negotiations would not take place on Axis Eternum. Voss had specified a location in her broadcast, the UES Prometheus, stationed in the Arcturus system on the border between human space and the wider galaxy. The choice was deliberate, and everyone knew it. The Council's rulers would come to humanity this time. Admiral Morin spent 3 days preparing the Prometheus with the meticulous attention of a man who understood that environment communicates what words sometimes cannot. The corridors were immaculate. The crew moved with the unhurried precision of a complement trained to the level where professionalism becomes indistinguishable from grace. When the GRC delegations arrived, they stepped out into a space designed to welcome without diminishing and to impress without intimidating. Human officers lined the walkway in perfect formation, their bearing absolute, their expressions calm and open and entirely without the eagerness to please that alien visitors had learned to expect from younger species. The GRC rulers walked past them in silence, and every single one of them registered the same thing. These people were not afraid. They were not performing confidence. They were simply, genuinely, unreservedly ready. KHO walked to the front of the council delegation, his expression controlled, his amber eyes moving with the reflexive vigilance of someone whose instinct had been honed by decades of political survival. He noted the technology integrated into the ship's walls, more sophisticated than anything the GRC had seen from human sources before, which meant it had been developed inside the sensor curtain during the silence, which meant the council had known even less than it thought. He noted the way Oracle 7, the ship's AI, greeted each ruler individually in their native language with perfect pronunciation and a warmth that was unsettling specifically because it felt genuine. "Welcome aboard the Prometheus, Overlord KO," Oracle 7 said, in flawless high Zedshale. "Ambassador Voss is ready for you." KHO said nothing. His jaw tightened by approximately 2 millimeters. The conference chamber was circular, like the Grand Conclave chamber, but with one critical, deliberately chosen difference. Every seat was the same height. Voss stood at the center of the room on an open floor, and she waited until every ruler was seated before she spoke. "Thank you for coming," she said, and the warmth in her voice was real, because it had never needed to be otherwise. "I know this was not simple for many of you. I want you to know that I recognize the courage it took to be here." She let the word settle. Courage. In a room full of rulers who had never in their lives been invited to consider whether what they were doing required it. "6 months ago, I walked out of a negotiation because you offered us chains," she continued. "Today I am not here to put chains on anyone else. I am here because I believe we can build something the galaxy has never had, something that makes chains unnecessary for everyone." She activated a holographic display that filled the center of the room with soft, steady light, and she presented humanity's framework. The first principle was sovereignty. No species surrenders its right to self-governance, not under economic pressure, not under military threat, not under any circumstances, for any reason, to any other party. This was the foundation everything else stood on, and it was not negotiable. The second principle was mutual exchange. Technology, knowledge, and resources shared through voluntary agreements between willing partners, never coerced, never demanded, never taken. The last 6 months have provided empirical proof that expertise offered freely generates more value than expertise extorted. The third principle was the dissolution of the Galactic Ruling Council and its replacement with a new body, the Galactic Open Forum. Every species with presence in space, regardless of age, power, or territorial size, hold one vote and one voice. No permanent seats, no vetoes, no special authority of any kind that could not be revoked by the body as a whole. The fourth principle was arbitration. Military disputes between species resolved through binding mediation by a neutral panel, not through annexation, not through absorption, not through the threat of either. The fifth and final principle was collective accountability. Any species that attempt to forcibly integrate, absorb, or subjugate another faces immediate, unified, and absolute sanction from every member of the forum. It was not a document that benefited humanity at the expense of others. It was a document that made real the thing the Council had always claimed to be, by creating the conditions under which it could actually be true. The room was quiet for a long time. The Koathi representative spoke first. "You would strip us of our power. You would keep every bit of authority over your own people in your own space," Voss replied. "What you would lose is authority over everyone else's. That is not power. That is a debt that accrues interest." The Thuresi representative, buzzing with the agitation of a hive mind encountering an idea that required it to reorganize its assumptions, asked through its translator what guarantee existed that humanity would not use its position to dominate the forum. "The same guarantee every other species has," Voss said. "One vote, same as everyone else. No veto, no permanent seat, no special privileges, including for us." The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It had a quality of consideration in it, something thoughtful moving through the room like a current. Councillor Sun was the first to move. She did not speak. She simply stood, walked to the document terminal with the measured pace of someone who has been waiting 400 years to do the specific thing, pressed her palm to the scanner, and added the Velisi communion seal to the framework. Then she turned to face the room, and her voice, when it came, was entirely steady. This is what we should have built 14,000 years ago. One by one, they followed, the Draathi first, quickly, with the undisguised relief of people who had been ready for this moment longer than they had admitted. Then the Omere, the Nef, the Tesseri, the Fail, the species that had already left the council signed with expressions that contained something remarkably close to joy. The remaining council species signed more slowly, with a careful deliberation of people who understand they are closing a chapter that will not reopen, each signature a small, irrevocable act of becoming something different than what they had been. KHO was the last. He sat for a long time after everyone else had signed, his ancient amber eyes fixed on Voss across the room with an expression that had shed everything performative and left only what was real underneath. Then he rose, walked to the terminal, and pressed the seal into the document with the slow, final deliberateness of someone setting down something they had been carrying for their entire life. He looked at her. "Did you plan all of this in the beginning?" he asked. His voice was quiet, stripped of its resonance, stripped of its authority, carrying only the genuine weight of the question. Voss met his gaze and held it. "We planned for every outcome," she said. "We just hoped it would be this one." He held her eyes for one long moment. Long enough, she thought, for something to pass between them that was more honest than anything said in 26 days of formal negotiation. Then he turned and walked out of the chamber without another word, and the door closed behind him. She stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the light of a galaxy that had just decided, for the first time in 14 millennia, to try something different. She breathed in the quiet. She breathed out everything she had carried for 7 years. Then she went to find her team, because there was work to do. The Galactic Open Forum held its first session 3 weeks later, and when the roster was called, 37 species answered. The largest cooperative body in galactic history, assembled not through conquest or coercion, not through the slow, grinding weight of a system that had made itself the only option, but through the simple and radical proposition that no one gets to decide who anyone else is. The session lasted 11 hours. There were disagreements, procedural disputes, moments of frustration, and moments of unexpected humor. It was messy and exhausting and alive in a way that the Grand Conclave Chamber had not been for a very long time. That evening, long after the celebrations had quieted and the diplomats had returned to their ships, long after the galaxy had begun the long, difficult, necessary work of becoming something better than it had been, Councillor Ara's son sat alone in her quarters aboard a Velisi transport and opened her private journal. She had kept it for 200 years. She turned to a clean page, looked at it for a long time, feeling the day's emotions settle in her as they always did, like sediment after water has been disturbed. And then she wrote, "I have lived 400 years and watched empires rise and collapse under their own weight. I have studied 1,000 species, learned their hearts, their fears, the particular shapes of their dreams. In all of that time, in all of that study, I had never been genuinely afraid of a species. I am afraid of the humans. Not because of their ships, though their ships are formidable. Not because of their weapons, though their weapons are more advanced than any of us knew. Not because of Oracle, though Oracle is something that keeps me awake in ways I cannot fully articulate. I am afraid of them because of something much simpler and much more difficult to defend against. They walked into a room full of gods, were told to kneel, and said no. And then they waited, calmly, patiently, without cruelty, without surrender, without the slightest tremor of doubt, for the gods to understand that they were the ones who should have been listening. I asked Ambassador Voss once, near the beginning of all this, what made humans different from every other species a council had tried to absorb. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said something I will carry with me for whatever centuries I have remaining. She said, "We are not different. Every species wants to be free. We are just the first one stubborn enough to walk out the door and trust that the universe would eventually agree with us." She was right. The universe agreed. And in doing so, it gave every species in the galaxy permission to want the same thing, not just to want it, but to believe that wanting it was enough, that it was, in fact, the only qualification required. I do not know what comes next. I do not think anyone does, and I think for the first time in 14,000 years that uncertainty is not a warning. It is an invitation. Sun closed a journal and looked out the viewport at the stars, the same stars that had watched civilizations rise and burn and be forgotten across billions of years, without comment, without preference, without anything that could be mistaken for care. Tonight, she thought, they seemed different. Not closer, not warmer, not changed in any way she could have measured or defended, but different nonetheless, as if they had been watching this particular story for a very long time, and had been quietly wondering how it would end. Now they knew, and the galaxy, uncertain and imperfect and gloriously unfinished, turned toward whatever came next. The Grand Conclave Chamber was older than memory, older, certainly, than any civilization that still had a name worth speaking. It sat at the heart of Axis Eternum like a throne room carved from the ribs of a dead star, cold and vast and ancient in the way that things become ancient when nothing has ever dared challenge them. 12 species ruled the known galaxy from that chamber. They had done so for 14,000 years without interruption, without genuine challenge, and without a single apology to the civilizations they had consumed along the way. They called themselves the Galactic Ruling Council. It was a name chosen with the deliberate precision of those who understand that language, wielded correctly, can substitute for argument entirely. Every spacefaring civilization that had ever crawled out of its home system had eventually bent the knee to the Council, some willingly, drawn in by the promise of protection and prosperity, some after wars that burned entire star clusters into graveyards that still glowed red across the light years. The method varied. The outcome never did. So when the youngest species in the galaxy received a formal invitation to sit at that ancient table, the Council expected what they had always expected from younger races: gratitude, submission, and silence. The silence was the most important part. A species that was grateful and submissive but still found ways to speak out of turn could be managed, but a species that learned to simply stop talking, to absorb its place in the order without complaint. That was a species that had truly been tamed. Ambassador Ara Voss was not built for any of those things. She stepped off the shuttle onto the polished obsidian deck of Axis Eternum with her back perfectly straight and her expression composed into something that read as calm but contained, upon closer inspection, the particular quality of calm that belongs to very deep water, still on the surface, and unknowably vast beneath. She was flanked by a small delegation of 6, 3 diplomats whose careers spanned conflicts she had helped resolve, 2 translators who could navigate linguistic nuance in 17 galactic languages, and a military aide named Captain Diran, who moved with the practiced quietude of shadow and had not yet said a single unnecessary word since they left Earth. The station's welcoming committee, a formation of ZHO soldiers, towering and covered in dark green scales that caught the light like hammered bronze, looked down at the humans with something balanced precisely between amusement and pity. They had seen this before. Small creatures from small systems, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the station, by its ceilings that disappeared into architectural darkness, by the weight of its history pressing down on every surface. Most species, when they arrived here for the first time, made some visible concession to that weight. They hunched slightly. They spoke too quickly. Their eyes moved in the anxious patterns of creatures who understood, on some animal level, that they had walked into the territory of something much larger than themselves. Voss did not flinch. She did not hurry. She did not lower her eyes. She had spent 20 years mediating the worst conflicts Earth had ever produced before the stars opened up: resource wars, border crises, ideological fractures that had threatened to split her planet into permanent factions, and she had learned in those years that the first person to look away in a negotiation was always the first person to lose. The ZHO guards watched across the docking bay with expressions that shifted, subtly, from amusement to something more uncertain. Pity, it turned out, required a certain kind of target. They were escorted through corridors lined with the banners of the 12 ruling species, ancient symbols of dominance woven into fabric that shimmered with living bioluminescent light, each one representing thousands of years of uncontested authority. The banners were enormous, deliberately so, Voss understood, because everything about Axis Eternum was deliberately scaled to make visitors feel small. She catalogued each banner as they passed, noting the colors, the iconography, the subtle hierarchies embedded in the arrangement. Knowledge was the only currency that mattered in rooms like these, and she had been accumulating it for years. There were no human banners. Not yet. But she noticed the empty bracket near the chamber entrance, installed with the careful confidence of those who assumed there would be one soon, hanging exactly where they had decided to put it. The Grand Conclave chamber itself was a revelation of calculated power. A vast circular space where the dome ceiling displayed a living, real-time holographic map of the known galaxy, every claimed system glowing in the color of its ruling species, an endless tapestry of possession and authority spread across the stars. Human space, 38 systems scattered along the outer reach of the Orion Arm, glowed in a faint, almost apologetic blue, like a child's drawing placed beside a master's canvas. Overlord Tyven Khal sat at the head of the curved table, and he was a kind of man, the kind of being who made the furniture around him look like an afterthought. His scaled fingers were steepled beneath his chin. His amber eyes tracked every step Voss took across the floor with the focused patience of a predator who has learned that waiting is simply another weapon. He was a ruler of the ZHL Dominion, the oldest and most powerful member of the Council, and in his reign alone he had personally overseen the absorption of 11 species into galactic order. To him, humans were simply the 12th. Ambassador Voss, he said, and his voice filled the chamber the way thunder fills a valley, not through any visible effort, but simply because it was built that way. Humanity is honored to be here, I trust. Voss took her seat, the smallest chair at the table. She noted immediately, positioned 3 centimeters lower than every other seat in the room, subtly but deliberately designed to place her at a physical disadvantage, to force her to look up at every other face in that chamber. She filed the observation away without comment, without any change in her expression, and smiled. "We are grateful for the invitation, Overlord Khal," she said. Her voice was warm, steady, and precisely controlled, the voice of someone who had decided exactly what it would sound like before she opened her mouth. "We look forward to productive discussions." Khal smiled back. It was a kind of smile that had, in 14,000 years of galactic civilization, never once meant anything good for the species sitting across from it.